Hello everyone, welcome to part 2 of this week's lecture. So as promised in this part, I'm going to talk through the PowerPoint on the rhetorical situation. Of course, you should look through this PowerPoint on your own as well. The rhetorical situation is very important, something we'll talk about this whole semester in every single essay that we write. So what is the rhetorical situation? The rhetorical situation, if we break it down, we've got rhetoric, which is persuasive speaking or writing. You might have heard this word with any sort of law-related movie or book or something that you've read. Rhetoric is simply just trying to persuade someone to believe something. And of course, a situation we know is the people or events or objects or relationships that surround a particular thing. If we were in a classroom, the situation would be all of you guys as students, it would be the building we were in, it would be the fact that it was COVID, all of those things inform what's going on. And I apologize if you hear my cats running about. It's dinner time and they're very excited about food. So, the rhetorical situation is the circumstances that influence persuasive speaking or writing. How we persuade other people depends on what this situation is. So whenever we write anything or speak, we're trying to figure out what's the rhetorical situation, how can we best address this situation, how can we best craft our rhetoric to persuade that other person. So we'll go through a couple of different parts of the rhetorical situation: purpose, audience, stance, and genre. And I think your book might address one more, which is medium, but we're going to leave that one out for the purposes of this essay and probably the rest of the essays that we do this semester. So purpose, what is purpose? Well, purpose is obviously why you're doing something, and all writing is purpose-driven. You could probably argue that all speaking is also purpose-driven as well. So if you're finding the purpose for your or someone else's writing, you want to think about what's the motivation, what's the goal or outcome, and specifically for the purposes of this essay, where you're trying to figure out the purpose of the speaker who's giving some sort of speech. What are they trying to persuade that audience to believe? So in this kind of funny example, of course, it's a tweet asking Wendy's how many retweets for your free chicken nuggets, and the purpose is to get a free chicken nuggets. That's pretty obvious. When you get into maybe your speeches or into art, activism, that sort of thing, the purpose can become a little muddled. I'm thinking too of like political speeches and things, or advertisements, where it's kind of hard to tell what the purpose is sometimes, what exactly they're trying to persuade you to believe. So you can kind of break it down. I've got two examples for you. One is a drawing slash visual art piece by Shirin Barghi. And this is from their #LastWords series. And so what you want to do whenever you're faced with how do I find the purpose of something, or how do I analyze something, you want to break it down into its component parts. Don't try to address something all at once. So break it down, you see a visual. The visual is, it looks like a sun in the middle of this giant black space. And then let's see what the words are. So we've got I can't breathe, and then at the bottom, Eric Gardner, 43, #LastWords, July 17th, 2014. So if you don't know the context, Eric Garner was a black man who was killed by the police in 2014. He was a gardener and his last words were, "I can't breathe," before he died. So we can think about with that context, and that's the sort of thing that you might research in your speech. What's the context for my speech? You can now start to think about, what do you think the purpose of the drawing is? Is it educational? Is it entertainment? Is it to be museum art? Is it to protest or for activism reasons? This was shared on Twitter with that hashtag last words. So I think a big part of it is for activism, for protest, in conjunction with Black Lives Matter, and also to be educational. So obviously, not everyone is going to have heard of Eric Garner. And so in a way, this is also educational. You might not have known his last words. You might not have heard of him before. You might have been too young to hear about that happening in 2014. So you want to think about, do you feel persuaded to believe or feel something as the audience? And that can be also a sign of what the purpose of this is. So this is a poem by Ross Gay, and it has a very similar purpose to the drawing that we just saw. It's a poem about Eric Garner. I think that this poem can accomplish a little more than the drawing can in terms of giving you more information and maybe creating a, at least in me, a stronger emotional response, where it talks about how he worked in the Parks and Rec horticultural department, and he's growing things in this kind of weirdly beautiful poem that's all about breath and breathing, and how he was helping the world breathe. And so if you know the context of his last words being, "I can't breathe," that can create a really strong emotional response. So both of these examples kind of show that visual rhetoric, like drawings or photos or movies and TV, even what you're wearing while giving a speech, that's a sort of visual rhetoric. And oral or written rhetoric, like speeches or essays or poems or social media posts, can both persuade their audiences, can both have similar purposes. Okay, so audience is the next thing that you want to think about with the rhetorical situation. It's the target for your rhetoric. Who are you trying to convince? This is a really, really important question. Whose minds need to be changed by the speaker's argument? So likely you will not be making an argument to someone who already believes what you're saying. Of course, for your speeches that you're going to be analyzing, the audience is usually just the literal audience sitting in the crowd and listening to the speech, but you should try to break it down and think about who that audience is. Are they a bunch of politicians? Are they a bunch of college graduates? That sort of thing. So how you persuade or argue is going to change based on who the audience is. You want to ask about, what's their background, their education, life experiences. Like I said, you're going to argue very differently to an audience full of really informed old white men, though that has changed recently as far as politicians go, versus a crowd of seniors in college about to embark on like full adulthood. So you want to think about also, what does the audience already know or believe about the topic? It's a lot less difficult to convince people who are already kind of on your side than people who are already set against you. And we've also all got something called confirmation bias. So we've got a tendency to favor information that confirms what we already believe. And so that plays into how much you're going to have to argue and how much you're going to have the burden of proof on you when you're giving a speech to someone. or trying to argue, convince them of something. And then lastly, you want to think about what your relationship is to the audience and how it should affect maybe language or tone. So if your speaker is giving a speech to family members or friends or a classroom of students they've had all semester, there might be a more familiar tone there. Think about, do you want to be perceived as an expert, or does your speaker want to be perceived as an expert or an authority figure? I'll skip these two examples because I think they're pretty self-explanatory. Make sure that you go through and read these. I'll break them down really quickly here, but it is very helpful to see clearly what I'm talking about as far as different audiences and how that really changes how you're going to give a speech. So this is two speeches by Dr. Anthony Fauci. One, he's giving to the National Institute of Health, their COVID-19 summit. He's addressing an audience of really intelligent scientists and researchers and medical professionals. They're not average people. They're experts in this, and you can tell in his language that he's using these words that, like, you and I are not going to understand probably. And that is showing that he understands who his audience is. They understand him because they're also experts. Versus this interview with Dr. Fauci on CBS News, which is loosely a speech, but I included it anyway. And here, his interview is being broadcast to normal people like you and me, and it's obviously reflected in his language. He's using more simplified language and explaining a lot more. And you can also read these two and think about purpose as well. Why is he there? Why is he explaining these things? What is he trying to convince his audience to believe? As you can probably guess, the medical professionals at the NIH already believe that COVID's a serious threat. They know that there are certain things that need to be done to get it under control. Versus maybe on CBS News, he's trying to convince an audience of people who might not believe that COVID is as big of a threat as it is and was when he gave this interview, and people who maybe like politicians who didn't believe and some still don't believe that measures need to be taken in order to control the spread. So you can read through both of those. They're really good examples of how your audience really affects how you're going to make an argument. Okay, so then we've got genre / I do talk a little bit about medium here, but your book goes into much more detail. So your genre basically is whatever type of persuasive rhetoric that you're using. There are different kinds. There's books, letters, texts, emails, blah, blah, blah. Of course, you're going to be dealing with oral rhetoric, which is speeches in this case for your assignment. And you're going to think about how mainly genre conventions work in this context. So genre conventions are characteristics that all of the works of the same genre basically share. You know, if you're going to a movie, every single time, no matter what movie it is, you're going to see video on the screen. There's going to be audio, there's going to be music behind the characters' voices. That's usually instrumental at different points. You know that it's going to be on a huge screen and it's going to be usually high def. Those are all genre conventions of movies. So there's the same thing when you're seeing a speech or listening to a speech. You expect certain things. You expect to see these things happen in a speech. So all of your speakers will probably follow certain genre conventions. I'm gonna cut this off really quick and actually have a part 3 of this, so make sure that you tune back in for that one.